The Library of Alexandria holds 400,000 scrolls, and the king pacing its marble floors is not satisfied. His name is Ptolemy, the second of his line to rule Egypt, and he has a hunger most kings never develop, not for gold, not for land, but for books. Every book, every language, every people who have ever written down what they believe about the world and about their God. He wants it all under one roof, in one city, in Greek, so that anyone who walks through these halls can read the whole of human wisdom without ever leaving Alexandria. You can imagine him standing before his librarian, a sharp, careful man named Demetrius of Phalerum, and asking a question that sounds simple. What is missing from these shelves? And Demetrius tells him something that stops the king cold. The Jews have a law, a set of sacred writings, older than Athens, older than Rome, that they believe came from their God's own hand, and it exists in only one language, not Greek, Hebrew, locked away in a script and a tongue that almost no one outside Judea can read. Ptolemy does not know it yet, but the letter he is about to send to Jerusalem will not simply fill a gap on his shelves. It will produce a Greek Bible that will outlive his empire, outlive Alexandria's glory, outlive Egypt itself. It will be read in synagogues from Rome to Babylon. It will be quoted by a rabbi from Nazareth who has not yet been born. And one day it will place a single Greek word, one word, into the mouth of an angel, spoken to a terrified carpenter in his sleep. We will get to that word. But not yet. This is not a story about a library. This is not a story about a vain king collecting trophies. This is not a story about 72 old men locked in a room with parchment and ink. This is a story about how the words God's people used to describe their own God quietly became the words a Greek-speaking world, and eventually the writers of the New Testament would use to describe him too. Here's what most people miss. When you open your Bible and read a verse from Isaiah, or Psalms, or the prophets, and then turn to the Gospels and see that same verse quoted by Jesus or Paul, you are very often not reading the same translation twice. You are reading a Greek text first, and then a Greek quotation of that Greek text. A text almost no modern Christian has ever heard the name of. Its name is the Septuagint, and you are about to find out who actually wrote it. Go back with me now to the moment Demetrius makes his confession. You have to understand who this man is. He was once a powerful statesman in Athens, exiled, and now he has remade himself into the most important librarian in the ancient world. He does not tell kings that something is missing from his shelves lightly, but this time he does. He explains to Ptolemy that the Jewish law, 5 books containing the story of creation, the flood, the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, the giving of the commandments on a smoking mountain, has never been translated into Greek. Not properly, not completely. If the king wants the full sweep of human wisdom in his library, this gap has to close. Stay with me, because what happens next is where the story stops being a footnote in library history and starts being something else entirely. Ptolemy sends a letter to Jerusalem, not a demand, a request, wrapped in diplomacy, addressed to the high priest, a man named Eleazar. Picture Eleazar reading that letter inside the temple precincts. A pagan king, ruler of Egypt, the nation that once enslaved his ancestors, is asking to borrow the sacred words of Israel's God and turn them into the language of Greek philosophers, Greek theater, Greek gods carved in marble. You can imagine the weight of that decision sitting on him. Say no and risk insulting the most powerful man in the Eastern Mediterranean. Say yes and risk something that feels to many of his own people far worse, handing over what is holy to be reshaped by foreign hands in a foreign tongue for foreign eyes. Eleazar says yes. He selects 72 men, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, a number chosen so carefully that no single tribe could claim the translation as uniquely theirs. These are not obscure scribes. According to the account written down by a court official named Aristeas, these are men fluent in both Hebrew and Greek, trained in the law, respected enough that their word on Scripture would be trusted back home in Jerusalem. Eleazar sends them to Alexandria along with something almost unthinkable, a copy of the Torah written in letters of gold. Now watch what happens next. When the 72 translators arrive in Alexandria, Ptolemy does not put them straight to work. He throws them a banquet, 7 days of it, and for 7 nights he tests them, not with trivial questions but with hard ones. Questions about justice, about kingship, about how a ruler should treat his people. One after another, these Jewish scholars answer him with wisdom that leaves the Greek court stunned. It is as if the king wants proof, before a single word is translated, that these men truly carry something worth putting into his library. Here's the part nobody tells you. The philosophical answers those 72 men gave at that banquet were, according to the ancient account, steeped in ideas that Greek philosophers themselves prized: self-control, justice, the good life. The translators were not simply linguists. They were showing the most powerful court in the Mediterranean world that the God of Israel had already been asking and answering the questions Greek philosophy was still wrestling with. Then the real work begins. They are given a place to work. Some accounts say a private residence on an island near Alexandria's harbor, quiet enough to concentrate, close enough to the sea that you can imagine the sound of it drifting through open windows as ink meets parchment. Hebrew words spoken by prophets and priests centuries earlier, now being carefully rendered into Greek, a language built for philosophy, for drama, for argument in the marketplace, now being asked to carry the weight of covenant, of mercy, of a God who makes promises and keeps them. The Hebrew word for that covenant loyalty is hesed, a word so rich that no single Greek word fully holds it. The translators reach for one anyway. They are not just swapping vocabulary. They are making theological decisions, sentence by sentence, that will shape how an entire Greek-speaking world understands the God of Israel. And they finish the entire task, by the account passed down to us, in exactly 72 days. You have to sit with that for a second. 72 men, 72 days. A translation that will be read for over 2,000 years. Born out of what started as one librarian's honest confession that something was missing from a king's shelves. Pause here for a second because it's easy to lose track of how strange this story really is. A Greek king who worshipped Greek gods just paid for and celebrated the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into his own language, not because he believed in Israel's God, because he wanted a complete library. And somewhere in that transaction, a transaction about book collecting, about royal vanity, about a librarian doing his job, something happened that neither Ptolemy nor Eleazar nor any of the 72 translators could have possibly seen coming. If a story like this is new to you and you want more of what the Bible doesn't put in a footnote, stay close. Hit subscribe before we keep going, because what happens to this translation over the next 300 years is where this gets almost impossible to believe. But here's the turn nobody expects. This Greek translation didn't stay in a library. It got out. And once it got out, it never went back. The translation is finished. Now comes the moment that decides whether any of it matters. Demetrius gathers the Jewish community of Alexandria, the largest Jewish population outside of Judea itself, and reads the completed work aloud, not just to leaders, to everyone who will come and listen. You can picture the crowd: merchants, craftsmen, mothers with children pulling at their sleeves, elders who remember hearing these words only in Hebrew, spoken only in synagogues, guarded like something too holy to risk. And now they are hearing the story of creation, the binding of Isaac, the parting of the sea, in Greek, in the language their own children speak in the marketplace, the language their grandchildren will grow up thinking in. According to the account, when the reading ends, the people do not sit in polite silence. They stand. They shout their approval. And then they do something that tells you everything about how they felt in that moment. They place a curse on anyone who would ever dare to change a single word of what has just been read to them. Think about that. These are people who could have resented a foreign king's interference in their sacred text. Instead, they treat the Greek version with the same reverence they gave the Hebrew original. In their eyes, this is not a copy. This is not a lesser cousin of the real thing. This is Scripture. But it gets stranger. Fast forward a century and a half. A Jewish philosopher named Philo is teaching in Alexandria, writing commentaries, defending his faith to a Greek and Roman world that mostly doesn't understand it. And when Philo quotes the Hebrew Scriptures, he does not translate them himself. He reaches for the Septuagint, this Greek translation born from a pagan king's library request, and treats it as directly divinely inspired, not inspired the way a good translation is inspired the way he believes the original prophets were inspired. In Philo's mind, God guided the hands of those 72 translators as surely as he guided the hand of Moses. A few decades after Philo, a Jewish historian named Josephus writes his own account of the whole affair. The king, the letter, the 72 scholars, the 72 days. He doesn't write it as legend. He writes it as history worth preserving for readers across the Roman world. Follow this closely, because the story is about to turn from acceptance to argument. By the 2nd century, something has shifted. Christians across the Roman Empire are using this same Septuagint to argue that Jesus is the Messiah, promised in Israel's scriptures. A Christian writer named Justin Martyr sits down with a Jewish rabbi named Trypho and argues point by point over what the ancient prophecies actually say. And the argument keeps circling back to the Septuagint's wording. Some Jewish communities, uneasy that their own Greek Bible is now being used as ammunition against them, begin producing new, tighter Greek translations of their own, ones that pull back from readings like parthenos in Isaiah, the very translation once celebrated with a feast and a curse against anyone who would change it, has become, in some circles, a text people wish they could take back. A Christian scholar named Origen watches this dispute unfold and does something remarkable. He builds an enormous 6-column reference work called the Hexapla, laying the Hebrew text, its Greek transliteration, and multiple rival Greek translations side by side on the same page, so that anyone, and in any argument, could check exactly what the ancient translators had written and why. Here's the part nobody tells you. By the time the first Christians start writing down the story of Jesus, an entire generation of Greek-speaking Jews, scattered from Alexandria to Rome, from Cyprus to Asia Minor, has never known any other Bible than this one. Not because they rejected Hebrew, because most of them, born and raised outside Judea, could no longer read it. The Septuagint isn't their second-best option. For millions of Jews across the empire, it is simply their Bible. Full stop. And that is exactly the world the apostles are born into. When Philip runs alongside the chariot of an Ethiopian official on a desert road and finds him reading aloud from the prophet Isaiah, The man is not sounding out Hebrew letters. He's reading Greek. He's reading the Septuagint. Luke doesn't even pause to explain this to his readers, because everyone in his audience already knows it. Of course, the eunuch is reading the Septuagint. What else would he be reading? When Jesus stands up in the synagogue at Nazareth and unrolls the scroll of Isaiah to read where it says the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, to preach good news to the poor. The wording that Luke records lines up with the Septuagint's Greek phrasing, not merely a private Hebrew reading. The Bible of the Greek-speaking synagogue is not some distant, secondary source for the writers of the New Testament. It is often their starting point. There's one more thing, and this is where it gets personal. Every time you read a New Testament writer quoting the Old Testament, Paul in his letters, the author of Hebrews building his argument, Matthew tracing the line from prophecy to fulfillment, there is a strong chance you are not reading a fresh Greek translation from the Hebrew. You are reading a quotation of a quotation. Words chosen by 72 men, working on an island off Alexandria's coast 3 centuries earlier, now being placed into the mouths of apostles who never met a Ptolemy and never asked for a library card. They inherited a Bible. They didn't build it from scratch, and the choices those long-dead translators made, word by word, verse by verse, became, without anyone planning it that way, the raw material the New Testament itself was built from. Now we come to the Word. Decades after the resurrection, a Jewish writer sits down to compose what will become the Gospel of Matthew. He is writing to convince a Jewish audience, steeped in the Scriptures, that Jesus of Nazareth is the promised Messiah. And to make that case, he reaches back 700 years to a prophet named Isaiah, standing before a frightened king named Ahaz, delivering a sign about a child who would be born. Here is what most people never stop to ask. Isaiah did not write in Greek. Isaiah wrote in Hebrew. And the Hebrew word he used for that coming child's mother was Alma, a word that simply means a young woman of childbearing age, not a technical, airtight word for virginity, a word for youth. But Matthew is not writing in Hebrew. Matthew is writing in Greek, for a world that reads in Greek. And when he reaches for that 700-year-old prophecy, he does not sit down and translate the Hebrew himself. He reaches for the Septuagint, the same Greek Bible born from a pagan king's library request 3 centuries earlier, and he finds that the 72 translators working long before Jesus was born, long before anyone had a reason to argue about a virgin birth, had already made a choice. They translated Alma as parthenos, not the ordinary Greek word for young woman. Parthenos, virgin, a specific, deliberate word. The same word used elsewhere in the New Testament 14 times, every single time rendered into English as virgin. This is not a story about a coincidence. This is not a story about Matthew inventing a doctrine to fit his narrative. This is a story about a translation choice made 2 centuries before Christ's birth, by men with no theological stake in a virgin birth, that Matthew simply discovered already sitting there in Israel's Greek Bible, waiting. He quotes it directly. "Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son. And they shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us." Remember the angel. Remember the terrified carpenter, asleep, wrestling with what to do about a pregnant fiancée he does not understand. That word, virgin, spoken over Joseph in his dream, confirmed by Matthew's quotation of Isaiah, did not originate in a Bethlehem stable or in Matthew's own pen. It originated 300 years earlier, on an island off the coast of Alexandria, when 72 translators sat with the Hebrew word Alma in front of them and chose parthenos. Hold that thought, because there's a twist still coming. For centuries, critics have argued that the Septuagint's Old Testament readings were less reliable than the Hebrew text later preserved by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes. That somewhere along the way, the Greek translators had drifted from the true original, and there was no way to check. The oldest Hebrew manuscripts anyone possessed were 1,000 years younger than the Septuagint itself. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, in caves overlooking the Dead Sea, a shepherd stumbled onto jars containing scrolls that had not been touched in nearly 2,000 years. Among them were Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, far older than anything scholars had ever held in their hands. And when researchers began comparing those ancient scrolls to the Septuagint's Greek readings that had been dismissed by some as loose, careless, or theologically motivated, they found something that stunned the scholarly world. In several places, the Septuagint's supposedly unreliable translation matched these newly discovered ancient Hebrew scrolls more closely than the later Masoretic text did. Think of it like a disputed will, locked away in a vault for 2,000 years, only to resurface and confirm the version everyone had assumed was the counterfeit. The Septuagint had not drifted from the truth. In places, it had preserved a genuine ancient Hebrew tradition that had simply been lost everywhere else. The translation born out of a Greek king's library request was not a shortcut around the truth. It was, in places, a window straight back into it. 72 men, 3 centuries before Christ, working from Hebrew scrolls now lost to history, chose their words carefully. And an angel's word to a sleeping carpenter, and a shepherd's discovery in a desert cave 2,000 years later, both trace back to that same choice. So what do you do with a story like this? Here is the first thing worth carrying with you. The Bible that Jesus read from in the synagogue, the Bible the apostles quoted in their letters. The Bible Philip found an Ethiopian official reading on a desert road. That Bible was, more often than not, the Septuagint, a Greek translation, born out of a pagan king's library project, carried forward by 72 men whose individual names history barely remembers, but whose word choices still shape what billions of people read today. Here is the second thing. If God could take a Greek king's vanity project, a request born out of nothing holier than wanting a complete library, and use it to carry his word to a scattered, Greek-speaking world, and eventually into the very language the gospel writers would use to describe his son, then very little in your own life is too ordinary, too accidental, or too secular for him to use.